At 4:26 a.m. morning, the Caribbean did not wake. It flinched. A blade of white light, thin, silent, almost surgical cut across the waters north of Punta Cardon. It burst from a tanker that should not have existed, a dark-hulled phantom with its identity erased, its flag stripped away, and its transponder as dead as a severed nerve. On paper, the vessel had never departed. In reality, it carried Venezuelan crude along a covert trajectory aimed toward Russia through waters where no legal tanker travels and no sanctioned operator survives. 70 nautical miles away, aboard a U.S. Navy destroyer, the flash was not dismissed as atmospheric noise. It was too sharp, too directional, too intentional. This was not a malfunction. It was a message broadcast in light instead of radio. Whatever happened on that phantom tanker was not an accident. And whatever force wanted to be seen had just revealed itself. In that single instant, the question shifted from what exploded to who needs Washington to notice and why now? Because that flash did more than scar the horizon. It cut open a hidden strategy, one engineered beneath trade routes, behind sanctions, and inside a shadow market threading Venezuela to Russia through the back door of the Caribbean. You are watching the first moment of a story that bends energy markets, military timelines, and geopolitical alliances. And if you think this was just an oil accident, stay here. The next part will break every assumption we thought we understood. At 4:26 a.m. morning, the Caribbean did not wake. It flinched, a blade of white light, thin, silent, almost surgical cut across the waters north of Punta Cardon. It burst from a tanker that should not have existed, a dark-hulled phantom with its identity erased, its flag stripped away, and its transponder as dead as a severed nerve. On paper, the vessel had never departed. In reality, it carried Venezuelan crude along a covert trajectory aimed toward Russia through waters where no legal tanker travels and no sanctioned operator survives. 70 nautical miles away, aboard a U.S. Navy destroyer, the flash was not dismissed as atmospheric noise. It was too sharp, too directional, too intentional. This was not a malfunction. It was a message broadcast in light instead of radio. Whatever happened on that phantom tanker was not an accident. And whatever force wanted to be seen had just revealed itself. In that single instant, the question shifted from what exploded to who needs Washington to notice and why now? Because that flash did more than scar the horizon. It cut open a hidden strategy, one engineered beneath trade routes, behind sanctions, and inside a shadow market threading Venezuela to Russia through the back door of the Caribbean. You are watching the first moment of a story that bends energy markets, military timelines, and geopolitical alliances. And if you think this was just an oil accident, stay here. The next part will break every assumption we thought we understood. The first assessments reaching U.S. analysts painted a familiar picture. An aging smuggler, a pressure failure, a tragic but predictable blast. Yet within minutes, that explanation collapsed. Patterns began forming, clean, synchronized, impossible to dismiss. 3 Venezuelan patrol craft started drifting toward the flash site, but none transmitted routine status reports. The radio stayed silent, their movements oddly aligned, as if guided by an unseen hand. Far offshore, a Russian signals intelligence trawler that had been sitting idle for hours suddenly powered up its long-range antennas, an action that made no sense unless it had been waiting for this exact moment. And deep inside the Gulf of Paria, another unregistered tanker, dark, fast, and absolutely illegal, began accelerating through restricted waters at a speed no compliant vessel ever risked. Its course sliced directly toward the smuggling corridor, as though responding to a cue the U.S. had not detected. These were not coincidences. They were rhythms, ships moving to the same beat. Someone was coordinating them, someone was masking them, someone was using the blast as the opening move of something larger. The U.S. Navy had seen smuggling rings, sanction evasion networks, and covert refueling chains, but nothing that aligned 3 nations' assets in the same 15-minute window. What initially looked like a minor maritime incident was beginning to resemble something else entirely. Deliberate probe. A test of how fast the U.S. Navy sees, reacts, and adapts inside contested waters. And if this was a test, one question overshadowed everything. Had someone just crossed the line that no nation can afford to cross? At 4:52 a.m. morning, the Combat Information Center aboard the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Porter received the first full-spectrum scan of the blast site. The data was immediate and unsettling. The heat plume was too narrow, too concentrated, too clean. Accidental ruptures bloom outward in chaos. This one pointed inward like a blade pushed through steel. Someone had struck the tanker. At 4:55 a.m. morning, the porter picked up a faint radar return to the west. The contact crawled at 8 knots, running dark, broadcasting nothing. Its hull geometry matched a notorious class linked to nocturnal oil transfers. The Zafiro shadow tankers, unregistered vessels used to siphon Venezuelan crude into covert refinement chains feeding Asia and increasingly Russia. The U.S. had tracked fragments of this network before, but never with this level of synchronization. At 5:06 a.m. morning, the situation deepened. The Russian signals intelligence vessel Karelia, publicly described as a research ship, altered course by 14 degrees and slowed to 5 knots. Its antenna arrays rotated toward the porter. This was not a random maritime maneuver. It was a listening posture, the kind used to capture electronic emissions from warships during moments of stress. At 5:12 a.m. morning, a U.S. reconnaissance satellite passed overhead. The imagery revealed a second clandestine tanker lurking 28 nautical miles south, engines at idle, as though waiting for a night transfer signal. What alarmed analysts most was that both tankers were using identical masking frequencies, civilian bands manipulated to resemble atmospheric interference. That technique had been observed in only one place: Russia's sanctioned bypass corridors in the Sea of Okhotsk. This was no smuggling improvisation. This was a blueprint copied from another theater. As the porter closed from 70 to 63 nautical miles, its AN divided by SPY-1 radar detected a 3-second narrowband burst originating from the Venezuelan coastline. The signal was brief but unmistakably structured. An encrypted relay bounced through a coastal station tied to PDVSA's offshore logistics grid. This raised a dangerous possibility. Either Venezuelan authorities had lost operational control of their infrastructure, or they were granting Russia access to run maritime operations from inside their sovereign network. Inside the Combat Information Center, tension hardened. Officers argued 2 interpretations. Was this simply a high-efficiency oil laundering chain? Or was it something far more strategic, a coordinated effort to reshape energy flows while measuring how long the U.S. Navy took to detect, interpret, and respond? Every minute, the porter shadowed the corridor in silence. Russian sensors harvested richer data. Every minute it moved closer, the risk of escalation matured. At 5:23 a.m. morning, the porter's captain faced a decision point: activate a full radar lock and expose the dark vessels, or maintain silence and continue mapping the network, knowing each second fed Russian intelligence. But before the captain could choose, a new piece moved on the board, and no one in that room had predicted it. If you were standing in the captain's place, would you illuminate the targets or keep the destroyer hidden to watch the web unfold? At 5:34 a.m. morning, the USS Porter executed a measured pivot, activating a low-power illumination sweep just enough to paint the unmarked tanker without signaling targeting intent. The radar return confirmed analysts' worst suspicion. The hull had been modified with external piping for ship-to-ship transfers, welded in patterns typical of Venezuela's covert export infrastructure. This vessel was not improvising. It was part of a system. At 5:38 a.m. morning, movement erupted across the maritime grid. 3 Venezuelan patrol craft altered course simultaneously, forming a loose containment arc around the blast site. Their transponders flicked back online, broadcasting clean, polite positional updates. But their geometry told a different story. They were positioning to fence the U.S. destroyer out of the corridor. Farther east, the Russian vessel Karelia made its most deliberate maneuver, yet shifting speed, turning 37 degrees and aligning itself directly between the porter and the second clandestine tanker. It did not retreat, it screened, a posture impossible to misinterpret. Russia was creating a buffer for Venezuela's shadow fleet. For the first time, intelligence officers spoke aloud what had been implied for days. A joint maritime shield, Russia providing electronic warfare and overwatch, Venezuela providing vessels and territorial cover. At 5:45 a.m. morning, signals intelligence intercepted encrypted traffic bouncing between 2 Venezuelan coastal nodes and an offshore satellite link of Russian origin. The timing, the frequencies, the routing, none of it resembled smuggler chatter. This was coordinated logistics. Venezuela was not merely selling oil. It was constructing a new maritime artery engineered to bypass sanctions and redirect crude into Russia's wartime supply chain at a moment when global markets were straining under Pacific tension with China. The porter held silent at 58 nautical miles from the blast site, inching closer with deliberate caution. But the network in view was larger than any one tanker or patrol craft. It was an interlocking system. Russian masking, Venezuelan platforms, foreign-built infrastructure, and a data trail, pointing to a broader energy axis stretching far beyond the Caribbean. At 5:52 a.m. morning, the porter's threat receiver spiked. A short, sharp, military-grade radar sweep brushed across its hull signature. It did not come from the patrol craft. It originated from a site near Puerto La Cruz, long suspected by analysts to host Russian personnel under technical exchange agreements. This sweep confirmed it. Russian operators were monitoring U.S. Navy movement from inside Venezuela's coastal grid. At the Pentagon, the briefing room shifted tone. What had begun as a smuggling investigation was now shaping into a contested maritime environment, one where Russia and Venezuela were testing how much control they could exert over a strategic corridor without firing a shot. If they succeeded, sanctions would buckle, energy flows would rewire, and U.S. naval power across both the Atlantic and the Pacific would face a precedent with global consequences. At 5:59 a.m. morning, the Porter's captain reached a strategic crossroads. Advance and risk an escalation with Russian-linked assets, or hold position and let a new oil axis strengthen unchecked. Both choices carried consequences, but the sea had not yet finished rearranging its pieces. If you were in command, would you press forward or wait for reinforcements and risk losing the corridor forever? At 6:03 a.m. morning, the conflict crossed a threshold. A new contact appeared on the Porter's long-range radar, an unregistered supertanker nearly 290 meters long, emerging from the shadows behind the Curaçao shipping lanes. Its bearing was precise, its speed unnervingly consistent, 12 knots, the exact tempo used by Russia's shadow fleet in the Far East. This was not an outlier. It was the next link in the corridor. Inside the Combat Information Center, analysts deployed a war simulation overlay, integrating ship movements, signal bursts, and regional choke point. The projection was stark. If 3 tankers synchronized with Venezuelan patrol craft under Russian coordination, the corridor could push over 100,000 barrels every 12 hours. Enough to reroute global pricing, enough to feed Russia's wartime economy, enough to undermine sanctions while the U.S. Navy stood within visual range. At 6:10 a.m. morning, the Porter's electronic warfare officer intercepted a narrow-band transmission following a pattern consistent with Russian naval doctrine. These were not ship-to-ship messages. They were guidance instructions relayed through a disguised tower along Venezuela's coast. The implication was unmistakable. Russian personnel were not assisting Venezuela remotely. They were physically embedded on Venezuelan territory, running command architecture from inside the host nation's infrastructure. At 6:15 a.m. morning, the Venezuelan patrol craft shifted again, closing in tight to form a controlled funnel that forced the Porter to alter course. None carried the displacement to threaten the U.S. Navy destroyer individually, but collectively their maneuver signaled intent without firing a shot. Hybrid maritime coercion, executed with the discipline of a state-backed doctrine. Meanwhile, in Washington, urgency escalated. Should the U.S. Navy move an aircraft carrier strike group into the Caribbean? Should NATO be briefed? Should sanctions expand? With Pacific tension rising and China probing U.S. resolve across the first island chain, every decision here carried consequences far beyond Latin America. Then came the next trigger. At 6:23 a.m. morning, a Venezuelan coastal battery, supposedly dormant, powered on its targeting radar. It did not lock onto the Porter. It simply brushed across the destroyer's hull signature, a calculated gesture meant to signal capability, not commitment. A warning, we see you. In response, the Porter raised its missile defense posture to passive readiness. No weapon illumination, no targeting lasers, just a silent shift, the kind the U.S. Navy uses to signal discipline, resolve, and deterrence without tipping toward escalation. Naval power here was measured not in fire, but in control. But the morning held a deeper shock. At 6:31 a.m. morning, satellite imagery revealed that the supertanker approaching from the north was not alone. 2 escort vessels running dark, no AIS, no markings moved in formation alongside it. Their silhouette matched Chinese-built Haiyang-class offshore protection ships, recently transferred to Venezuela under coastal modernization programs. Their presence in this corridor meant one thing. China was not merely watching U.S. Navy behavior in the Pacific. It was studying U.S. Navy reaction in the Caribbean. 3 nations, Russia, Venezuela, China, moving in harmony, not chaos, not improvisation. A converging strategy. The Porter's captain now stood before a decision with geopolitical weight. Advance and risk, triggering a multinational showdown, or hold back and allow the largest sanctioned bypass operation of the decade to solidify into permanent. Neither path offered safety. But the sea was already aligning for a revelation far more dangerous than anyone expected. If you commanded the porter, would you escalate presence or gamble on restraint to expose the full network? At 6:42 a.m. morning, the twist revealed itself not through a missile launch or a radar lock, but through a silence so engineered that every officer aboard the USS Porter sensed something was wrong before the instruments confirmed it. The destroyer's sensors did not go blind, they went selective. The Venezuelan patrol craft remained visible. The Russian trawler remained visible. The coastline signatures remained visible. Yet the three clandestine tankers that formed the backbone of the corridor began to fade one after another, their returns thinning with an unnatural symmetry that ruled out weather interference within seconds. This was a deliberate extraction, a frequency manipulation calibrated to peel them out of the Porter's detection picture. At 6:45 a.m. morning, the source emerged, a directional interference beam from the Venezuelan coastline, its modulation identical to a Russian prototype jammer once observed in Crimea, underpowered, precise, and designed specifically to avoid triggering automated countermeasures. What deepened the shock was its routing. The beam passed through a Venezuelan tower, wired directly into a Chinese-built fiber backbone, confirming the presence of a tri-nation stealth architecture operating in real time. At 6:49 a.m. morning, satellite imagery made the deception unmistakable. The tankers had not disappeared. They had moved into a staggered formation that merged their radar reflections, producing the harmless profile of a single slow-moving vessel on lower-grade sensors. To the Porter, they now looked like one oversized ghost drifting toward open water, when in reality, three tankers were slipping through a blind spot no U.S. Navy destroyer should ever allow to exist. An officer finally put the unspoken truth into words. This was no smuggling run. It was a controlled test of U.S. Navy sensor vulnerability. At 6:51 a.m. morning, the Russian trawler Karelia activated a narrow encrypted uplink to a geostationary satellite normally used for Pacific naval operations. The routed channel made the intent obvious. China was receiving the feed live. What the corridor moved was oil, but what it produced was intelligence on how a U.S. Navy destroyer interprets pressure, adapts under distortion, and maintains naval power inside contested waters. At 6:54 a.m. morning, a Venezuelan coastal drone, guided by Chinese navigation systems, lifted into the sky and began orbiting the corridor. Its camera did not track the tankers. It tracked the Porter, recording sensor sweeps, defensive arcs, and posture adjustments. This was not a confrontation. It was reconnaissance disguised as commerce, a rehearsal for scenarios far more complex than sanction evasion. And then at 6:57 a.m. morning came the final confirmation. A burst from a classified U.S. intelligence channel revealed that two additional tankers had departed a concealed Venezuelan cove before the flash that started this crisis. The explosion was not a malfunction. It was a decoy, an engineered signal designed to pull a U.S. Navy destroyer into a controlled intelligence trap orchestrated by Russia, Venezuela, and China with mathematical precision. A hidden strategy had unfolded across two oceans and three aligned actors. It had bypassed sanctions, degraded sensors, mapped U.S. Navy behavior, and tested how far American dominance could be bent without a single shot fired. Now, within the Combat Information Center, one question pressed heavier than the rising sunlight outside. If the U.S. Navy responds forcefully, doesn't neutralize the corridor or ignite the spark of a wider confrontation the world is not ready to face. By 7:21 a.m. morning, the scale of what had unfolded in the Caribbean was no longer a matter of interpretation. A single flash on the horizon had exposed a coordinated energy corridor linking Venezuela, Russia, and quietly but unmistakably China. This was not smuggling, and it was not improvisation. It was a system, a layered structure built to bypass sanctions, disguise oil flows, and test how far the U.S. Navy's detection architecture could be pushed before responding. Inside the Pentagon, analysts replayed every spike, every distortion, every evasive maneuver captured by the Porter, and the pattern was undeniable. This corridor functioned less like a supply chain and more like a rehearsal, an early prototype for how multiple nations might one day challenge U.S. naval power on parallel fronts. The most unsettling element was the electronic masking, the jammer signatures, the radar merges, the tri-nation routing. They echoed tactics China has tested in the South China Sea and along the first island chain, regions already strained under Pacific tension. If Beijing could study U.S. Navy sensor behavior from a Caribbean testbed, it could accelerate its maritime strategy in the Pacific, where aircraft carrier groups safeguard the world's most vital sea lanes. What the Porter documented in these waters may influence how China approaches future standoffs around Taiwan, the Luzon Strait, or the Spratly Archipelago, yet the Porter's response, calm, measured, deliberately restrained, revealed something critical about American power. Naval dominance is not simply the ability to escalate. It is the discipline to deny escalation when adversaries attempt to provoke it for strategic advantage. The destroyer did not illuminate weapons, did not force an encounter, did not fall into the role the corridor was designed to script. Instead, it observed, documented, and pulled the shadow axis into the light. That restraint, rather than aggression, is what separates a global power from those attempting to imitate one. Still, the broader picture demands clarity. If Russia can project capability into the Western Hemisphere through Venezuela, if Venezuela can mass tankers behind Chinese-built infrastructure, and if China can harvest real-time U.S. Navy data from an operation thousands of miles from the Pacific, then the strategic map is shifting faster than many governments are willing to admit. Energy is being weaponized. Maritime corridors are being rewritten. Sanctions are being eroded not by smugglers, but by state-enabled systems designed to endure, adapt, and expand. In that world, the U.S. Navy is more than a fleet. It is the architecture that prevents global waters from fracturing into competing spheres of shadow influence. Naval power exists not to ignite conflict, but to ensure that others cannot reshape oceans to their advantage while the world looks elsewhere. And as the morning light spread across the Caribbean, the porter's mission revealed an uncomfortable truth. The new oil axis had not just exposed its methods, it had exposed its ambition. What happened today may be only the opening move. The next test could emerge in the Arctic shipping lanes, the Eastern Mediterranean, or the Pacific choke points where China's long-term strategy intersects with Russia's geographic limits and Venezuela's economic desperation. In an era defined by hidden strategies and contested oceans, the smallest hesitation or the smallest misread can alter the trajectory of an entire decade. The story in these waters has not closed. It has simply marked its beginning. If understanding global strategy matters to you, stay with us, because what comes next will shape more than headlines. It will shape the balance of the world. Now, the question remains, is this tri-nation corridor the first sign of a larger challenge to U.S. dominance or the final gamble of regimes running out of time?